Well, we should now do the opposite. We should parasite the capitalism. We should parasite the infrastructure that it manages to create and strange, muted form of public infrastructure that it provides. Well, climbing up here, we were asked, what does hacking ideologies means? And it got me thinking, and it could be turned. It's not only about ideologies of hacking or hackers or hacker practices, hacker culture. It's also very much how practices of hacking, particularly free software hacking, have transformed how we think about ideologies. If we consider critique of political economies, such as Marxian critique of political economy, the results of that were attempts to create communist societies, but which were basically focused around one segment of critique of economic relations, and that is relations of production. And we oftentimes like to see free software as and other forms of peer production and production of commons as a problem of how to create community, right? Like Wikipedia, how commons, how common goods are created through communal effort, distributed effort, and how finally workers get the ownership of what they've created. And that was very much what real socialist societies tried to do. They tried to create worker-owned enterprises, and the whole issue was of solving the problem of capitalism was how to give back to producers the tools of production and the processes of production, so relations of production. However, most of these efforts have ignored the other side of Marxian critique of political economy, and that is the critique of circulation of goods and consumption. So, for instance, in former Yugoslavia, where I come from, there was immediately after the Second World War, big debate when they wanted to introduce the worker-owned companies and autogestion by workers, whether there should be property form or not. And in the end, property form theory won, and we had property in a very strange way, but nonetheless we still had property, private property. And this is where I think that free software sort of kicks in. Richard Stallman was very adamant in emphasizing that free software is not so much about producers, but it's primarily about users, giving power to the users, and not how we can give ownership of means of production and processes of production back to producers. So it's not so very much about if software hackers own copyright and can make it free, but it's much more like we don't need ownership because the primary perspective, ethical perspective, is that what we get in terms of goods, we can freely share, we can copy and distribute. So it's about exchange, it's about circulation, and much less about production. And in this sense, I would say that this stress upon user perspective in free software cuts across the division between communism and capitalism. I don't think that either of those categories, from the perspective of critique of ideology, fit quite what the attempt was behind Stallman's formulation. They just don't clarify this very specific idea that ownership does not belong to the producers, but that there is a social contribution which is viewed from the perspective of sharing, from the perspective of users, from the perspective of users qua producers and producers qua users. And this is, I think, very important point that what free software creates is a sort of continuum of exchange between producers and users, users qua producers, producers qua users, and that that continuum of exchange is primarily a continuum of knowledge. Therefore, I think that we should maybe try to also reflect how this intervention that didn't have anything to do with the critique of material economy, but had all to do with immaterial economy, basically cuts across these categories which were produced to create a critique of material economy, so communism and capitalism. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? Is this thing on? Hi, my name is Dimitri Kleiner. I'm with a workers' collective here in Berlin called Telekommunisten, and I'm involved in a project of hacking ideologies called venture communism. In the opening, we heard from Tony Prug a quote from Eric Raymond that he wants to make free software more favorable to investors and managers. And this is, I think, sort of the key point of departure between the open source movement and the free software movement. This idea of pleasing investors and managers, making free software more appealing to them. So it's an interesting question. What would make free software more appealing to them, and why isn't free software appealing to them? Who are investors and managers? Well, investors are the administrators of finance capital. They're the people that represent the great pools of capital that is made available to fund startups. And managers are the instruments of their control. So managers are the extensions of capital control. What would make them happy? Well, one thing is to understand what capitalism is. So what is capitalism? Capitalism, in simply defined, is a system of class stratification whereby a certain segment of society has removed itself from direct production by controlling the means of production of the direct producers and appropriating their product for redistribution. So getting in the middle of the direct producers and their instruments of production, appropriating the product for redistribution, and being able to control the distribution of the product. This is what capitalism is, right? So capitalism requires control. It requires control of the productive process, and in particular, the control of the output of the productive process, the actual product to be redistributed. So the sort of problem with free software is not so much any of the principles of the GPL. I mean, of course, the share-alike principle is a certain problem because of the inability to, extend and capture. But the real problem is the emphasis on freedom, because in order for capitalism to function, capitalism requires control. So what Eric Raymond really means when he talks about the negative stereotypes of the Free Software Foundation types in the free software community is the emphasis on freedom that community tends to have. And he wants to change that to an emphasis on pragmatism, to an emphasis on efficiency and productive utility. And of course, capitalism itself is not inherently opposed to that. Free software is by no means the only example of a standard intellectual input that is used widely in production. I mean, there's very banal examples of things like standardized nuts and bolts, or international standards of measures, or the myriad of ITU and ISO industry standards. The idea of having standard intellectual components that all capitalists use that make production more efficient is not itself new, dangerous, or radical. What is interesting about free software is what's implied by pure production processes, by unmediated, uncontrolled production processes that emphasize freedom and sharing and that lack this controlling element of directly controlling property, right? So the purpose of making free software more appealing to investors and managers is exactly that, is by offering the means to describe free software in terms that don't imply freedom, don't encourage freedom, but actually encourage utility. And it's a rephrasing of the argument more than it is than a rephrasing of its methods or its principles. It's a rephrasing of the argument from being phrased in a way that might lead you to challenge the actual relations of production and the actual relations of producing and sharing to a way that accepts the extension of control and allows you to embody control within the system of production. I think I'll leave it at short. It's a very sort of complicated topic, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask either during this or after. Thank you very much.
So I guess it's to you whether you have any comments or questions or clarifications.
Okay, I got a comment to you. Sorry, I didn't get your name.
Tony.
Tony, okay. Normally I would like to comment your ideas, which I find really interesting, but you really got me angry with one thing. I think it's absolutely unacceptable, your comparison between capitalism and Holocaust. That really got me, that's really absolutely unacceptable. Okay, I think I don't have to explain that. That it's a huge difference of everything. If you kill people because you want to kill them and no reason or if you take cynically in account that millions of people die like capitalism does, and yeah.
I've got no comment. I mean, I'm glad I made you angry. That was the point. I mean, I hope it makes you think.
Well, I have a slightly less ideological point. I am involved in the software patent debate, and if you talk to the people who favor those patents, they say, well, we really need those patents because we have to protect our business against too fierce competition. And then I say, well, but you do live in a capitalist world where free competition is the core of the capitalist world. So actually
Free competition is the opposite of capitalism. Capitalism is about control of the means of production to extract surplus value. Competition reduces the price of anything to its actual production costs. Competition and capitalism are completely incompatible. In order for anybody to capture value by owning things, they have to eliminate competition because competition actually reduces price.
Yeah, yes, then indeed we talk about the very same paradox, because usually the people who favor capitalism are the same people who are liberal people who try to favor the free market. So well, we agree, I think.
When they talk about the free market, they mean their right to privately own the natural resources that everybody depends on.
I mean, sorry, just a short comment to this before you ask a question. One thing that we didn't mention here, which came up through completely different projects and thoughts of research, was that with all the talk about intellectual property and how great it is to have things, to share things, and to have them so easily available, ultimately it is still the land on which everything gets produced and on which we live. And in country where I live, in UK, in England actually, the land registry is closed, and you can voluntarily disclose what land you own, but you're not entitled to do so. And if you research into it, people have a legal right to stop you from finding what land you own. And I think, being the mother of one of the places where industrial revolutions happened in the most extreme ways, it shows why. I don't think it's for nothing. I think it's symptomatic of something else, which is for us convenient not to discuss or not to think about the land. So, sorry, go on with the question.
What I want to ask you is your opinion of the idea that capitalism means to generate more value, and the sharing of knowledge and the sharing of ideas is a way to generate more knowledge and more ideas. So somehow it's similar, I think.
Can you, what's your action? Can you be clear?
When you share your knowledge, you make it possible to take it by others, and yes, generate new programs, new source code, for example. So I think somehow it fits very good to capitalism, because the generation of more
You mean creation of more knowledge is good for capitalism? You think it's
one thing that capitalism has a problem with, because